Chicago, 1925. The city never truly slept. Even after midnight, the streets buzzed with activity. Streetcars clattered across steel rails, taxis rushed through crowded avenues, and music drifted through the warm night air from clubs hidden behind unmarked doors. To the outside world, Chicago looked like any other thriving American city. But behind the bright lights and crowded sidewalks, a different world existed. A world built on illegal alcohol, secret deals, and organized crime. America was living through the strange and turbulent years of Prohibition in the United States. In 1920, the United States government banned the production and sale of alcohol. Supporters believed the law would reduce crime, improve public health, and strengthen American families. Instead, the opposite happened. Alcohol didn't disappear, it simply went underground. Across the country, secret bars known as speakeasies appeared almost overnight. Hidden rooms in restaurants, basements beneath apartment buildings, and back rooms of ordinary businesses all became places where alcohol flowed freely. Bootleggers smuggled whiskey from Canada. Illegal breweries produced thousands of gallons of beer every week. Millions of Americans continued drinking as if the law didn't exist, and criminals quickly realized the opportunity. Supplying alcohol to a nation that still wanted to drink could generate enormous profits. Nowhere was that opportunity greater than in Chicago. The city became one of the most important centers of America's illegal alcohol trade. Competing criminal organizations fought to control the supply routes, the breweries, and the speakeasies. Violence became common. Drive-by shootings, bombings, and assassinations turned certain neighborhoods into battlegrounds. And at the center of this chaotic world stood one man. A man with a round face, a confident smile, and a reputation that made rivals nervous. His name was Al Capone. For nearly a decade, Capone would dominate Chicago's criminal underworld. Some people saw him as a ruthless gangster. Others saw him as a businessman who simply gave people what they wanted. But the truth was more complicated. Al Capone was both, and the story of how he rose to power begins far from Chicago. It begins in Brooklyn, New York. Alphonse Gabriel Capone was born on January 17, 1899 in Brooklyn. His parents had come to America from southern Italy, part of a wave of immigrants searching for better opportunities in the growing cities of the United States. His father, Gabriel Capone, worked as a barber. His mother, Teresa, cared for their growing family. They were hard-working people who believed in discipline, family loyalty, and the promise of the American dream. But life in Brooklyn's immigrant neighborhoods was not easy. Families lived in crowded apartment buildings. Jobs were difficult to find, and money was always tight. The streets were noisy, competitive, and sometimes dangerous. For young boys growing up in these neighborhoods, survival often meant learning how to defend yourself. Street gangs operated openly in many parts of the city. Some gangs were little more than groups of teenagers causing trouble. Others were connected to organized crime. Young Al Capone grew up surrounded by this environment. He was a strong, confident boy who quickly learned the rules of the streets. Respect mattered, strength mattered, and loyalty to your friends mattered above everything else. Capone attended school for several years and showed signs of intelligence, but he struggled with discipline. Teachers described him as disruptive and quick to anger. Eventually, after a violent confrontation with a teacher, Capone was expelled from school at the age of 14. That moment changed the direction of his life. Without school, Capone spent more time on the streets. He took odd jobs to earn money, working in stores and helping around local businesses. But he also spent time with neighborhood gangs. These groups offered something that young boys often craved: a sense of belonging, protection, and the chance to gain respect. One of the most influential gangs Capone became associated with had ties to the notorious 5 Points Gang. This organization had already produced several future leaders of organized crime. The Five Points Gang operated in New York's Lower East Side and was known for violence, theft, and political connections. For young men like Capone, joining such groups provided both protection and opportunity. Capone began learning the basic skills that would later define his career: how to intimidate rivals, how to organize illegal businesses, and how to build loyalty among those who worked for him. It was also during this period that Capone developed the nickname that would follow him for the rest of his life: Scarface. While working as a bouncer at a bar in Brooklyn, Capone made an inappropriate comment to a woman. Her brother reacted immediately. A fight broke out. During the struggle, the man slashed Capone across the face with a knife. The wounds left permanent scars running down his cheek. Capone hated the nickname Scarface and tried to avoid it whenever possible. But the name spread quickly, and over time, the scars became part of his intimidating image. Despite the injury, Capone continued climbing through the ranks of New York's criminal world, and soon he met a man who would shape the next stage of his life: Johnny Torrio. Johnny Torrio was very different from many criminals of his time. He was calm, patient, and highly intelligent. Where others relied on brute force, Torrio believed in planning and organization. He viewed crime as a business. Profit came from strategy, not chaos. Torrio recognized Capone's potential immediately. The young man was ambitious, loyal, and fearless. Under Torrio's guidance, Capone began learning how organized crime actually operated. He learned about networks of influence, how to maintain relationships with politicians, how to manage large operations that generated steady profits. For Torrio, Capone was more than just another street thug. He was a future leader. And soon, that leadership opportunity would arrive. In the early 1920s, Torrio moved to Chicago to help manage criminal operations there. Chicago was growing rapidly, and the criminal underworld was expanding just as quickly. When Prohibition began, the opportunity became enormous. Illegal alcohol distribution quickly turned into one of the most profitable businesses in America. Torrio needed trusted allies, so he invited Capone to join him in Chicago. Capone accepted immediately. The move would change his life forever. When Capone arrived in Chicago, the city was already becoming one of the most important centers of organized crime in the United States. Speakeasies operated in nearly every neighborhood. Bootleggers transported alcohol through hidden routes across the city. Criminal organizations competed for control of these operations. Working together, Torrio and Capone began building a powerful network. They organized illegal breweries. They controlled transportation routes, and they supplied alcohol to hundreds of speakeasies. The profits were enormous. Within just a few years, the organization was earning millions of dollars. Capone quickly proved himself valuable. He could negotiate deals with businessmen and politicians. But he could also intimidate rivals when necessary. This combination made him extremely effective in the criminal world. However, the growing wealth and influence also created enemies. Other gangs wanted the same territory. Competition quickly turned into violent conflict. Shootings and bombings became common across the city. Chicago was turning into one of the most dangerous places in America, and the struggle for power had only just begun. By the mid-1920s, Al Capone was no longer just a young gangster learning the business. He was becoming one of the most powerful figures in Chicago's criminal underworld. But the path to complete control would not come without bloodshed. And in the years ahead, the city would witness violence on a scale it had never seen before, because the era of Al Capone had only just begun. The resa of a crime empire. By the mid-1920s, Chicago had become one of the most violent cities in America. The profits from illegal alcohol were simply too large for criminal organizations to ignore. Every gang wanted a share of the bootlegging trade. Territory meant money, and money meant power. And in this dangerous environment, Al Capone was rising rapidly through the ranks of organized crime. But at this point, he was not yet the undisputed leader of Chicago's underworld. That position still belonged to the man who had mentored him from the beginning. Johnny Torrio. Torrio was respected across Chicago's criminal world. Unlike many gang leaders who ruled through constant violence, Torrio preferred negotiation and strategy. He believed criminal organizations could function like corporations, generating profits while avoiding unnecessary attention from law enforcement. For several years, Torrio's approach worked. The organization expanded its bootlegging operations throughout Chicago. Hidden breweries produced massive amounts of alcohol. Trucks delivered shipments to hundreds of speakeasies across the city. Money poured into the organization at an astonishing rate. But success also attracted enemies. One of the most powerful rival groups in Chicago was led by a gangster named George "Bugs" Moran. Moran controlled the North Side Gang. Unlike Torrio and Capone, Moran was fiercely opposed to their expansion. His gang fought aggressively to protect its territory. The conflict between these organizations gradually escalated into open warfare. Shootings between rival gangs became common. Bombings targeted warehouses and breweries. Entire neighborhoods lived in fear of sudden violence. And eventually, the rivalry turned deadly. In January of 1925, Johnny Torrio became the target of an assassination attempt. Gunmen from a rival gang ambushed him outside his home. They opened fire at close range, shooting Torrio several times. Although he survived, the attack forced him to reconsider his future. Torrio had already earned a fortune from the bootlegging business. Continuing to lead a criminal empire now seemed like an unnecessary risk. After recovering from his injuries, Torrio made a decision. He would retire. Before leaving Chicago, he called Capone into his office. Torrio trusted Capone more than anyone else in the organization. He believed the young gangster had the intelligence and determination necessary to lead the operation. So Torrio handed control of the entire organization to him. At only 26 years old, Al Capone suddenly became the most powerful crime boss in Chicago. Capone wasted no time expanding the empire. Under his leadership, the organization grew even larger. Illegal breweries operated around the clock, producing thousands of gallons of beer and whiskey. Delivery trucks moved alcohol across the city using carefully planned routes designed to avoid police attention. Speakeasies multiplied across Chicago. Many of them relied entirely on Capone's network to supply alcohol. Capone also expanded into other criminal businesses. Gambling operations flourished under his protection. Prostitution rings operated throughout the city. At the peak of his power, Capone's empire generated an estimated $100 million every year, an enormous fortune for the time. But Capone understood something many criminals overlooked. Power was not just about money. It was about influence. So Capone worked carefully to build relationships with politicians, police officers, and city officials. Bribes ensured that many authorities ignored his activities. Police raids often targeted smaller gangs, while Capone's operations continued without interference. For a while, it seemed as though Capone had built a system that protected him completely. But the rivalry with George, Bugs, Moran continued to grow. Moran's North Side Gang remained Capone's most dangerous competitor. They controlled important bootlegging routes and several profitable speakeasies. Both sides launched attacks against each other's businesses. Drive-by shootings became increasingly common. Bombings destroyed warehouses and delivery trucks. Chicago newspapers began reporting on the escalating gang violence. The city's reputation as a center of organized crime grew rapidly. Yet neither side seemed willing to back down. The conflict continued year after year, until finally, Capone decided to end it permanently. The plan of the plan was carefully organized. Capone's associates learned that several members of Moran's gang would be meeting inside a garage on Chicago's north side. They believed they were expecting a shipment of illegal whiskey. Instead, Capone's men prepared an ambush. On the morning of February 14, 1929, several gunmen dressed as police officers arrived at the garage. The gang members inside believed they were being arrested. Following orders, they lined up against a brick wall. Moments later, the fake officers pulled out machine guns. Gunfire exploded inside the garage. Within seconds, 7 men were dead. The killers calmly walked away. The event became known as the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. The massacre shocked the entire nation. Newspapers printed graphic photographs of the crime scene. The brutal killings dominated headlines across America. Although Capone denied involvement, most investigators believed the attack had been ordered by him. The massacre turned Capone into the most infamous gangster in the country, but it also created a serious problem. Public outrage was growing, and the federal government began looking for ways to stop him. Federal Gouvernement Starais Bake. For years, law enforcement had struggled to prosecute Capone. Witnesses were too afraid to testify. Local officials were often corrupt. Evidence was difficult to obtain. Capone seemed untouchable. But federal investigators realized something important. They did not need to prove Capone had committed violent crimes. They only needed to prove he had broken the law. And eventually, they found the evidence they needed, not through gun battles or gang wars, but through financial records. Investigators began examining Capone's income. They discovered that he had earned millions of dollars through illegal businesses. Yet he had never paid taxes on that money. Even illegal income was still taxable under United States law. This discovery gave prosecutors a powerful weapon. In 1931, Capone was officially charged with tax evasion. Trial of Al Capone. The trial attracted enormous attention. Newspapers across the country followed every development. For the first time, the man who had ruled Chicago's underworld was facing serious consequences. Capone entered the courtroom confident. He had avoided prison for years. Many believed he would escape punishment again, but the evidence presented by prosecutors was overwhelming. Financial records clearly showed that Capone had hidden large amounts of income. Witnesses testified about the enormous profits generated by his criminal empire. After listening to the evidence, the jury reached a decision. Guilty. Capone was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison. For the first time since arriving in Chicago, the most powerful gangster in America had finally been defeated. Joe. Yet even in defeat, the story of Al Capone was far from over. Because prison would change his life in ways no rival gang ever had, and the fall of his empire was only just beginning. Sentenced Hoprason. In 1931, the courtroom fell silent as the judge announced the sentence. 11 years in federal prison. For years, Al Capone had seemed untouchable. Gang wars had failed to destroy him. Police investigations had failed to convict him. Even political pressure had not been enough to bring him down. But in the end, the man who controlled a criminal empire worth millions of dollars had been defeated by something simple. Taxes. At first, Capone appeared calm when the verdict was delivered. He had expected a prison sentence before, and in the past, his influence had always found a way to reduce the punishment or arrange comfortable conditions. But this time was different. The federal government wanted to make an example of him. Capone was sent to the federal penitentiary in Atlanta, Georgia. For a short time, it seemed like prison life would not be too difficult. Even behind bars, Capone remained famous. Guards treated him with a mixture of curiosity and respect. Some prisoners admired him, others feared him. But prison officials soon discovered a problem. Even from inside prison walls, Capone still had influence. He was able to communicate with associates outside. He received favors, and there were concerns that he might continue running parts of his criminal organization from behind bars. The government decided something had to change. Transferta Eras in 1934, Capone was transferred to one of the most secure prisons in the United States, Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary. Located on a small rocky island in San Francisco Bay, Alcatraz had a reputation unlike any other prison. The facility was designed to hold the most dangerous and influential criminals in the country. Escape was nearly impossible. Cold water surrounded the island. Strong currents made swimming extremely dangerous, and the prison itself was built with strict security measures. Most importantly, Alcatraz was designed to prevent inmates from using influence or money to control the system. Inside Alcatraz, every prisoner followed the same rules. There were no special privileges, no bribery, no connections. For the first time in many years, Al Capone was just another inmate. Prisoner number 85. L'FNCD Meshti Prison. Life at Alcatraz was harsh and extremely structured. Inmates woke early each morning. They worked assigned jobs throughout the day. Meals were simple and carefully supervised. Guards enforced strict discipline. Any violation of the rules could result in punishment or isolation. For a man who had once commanded a vast criminal empire, the experience was deeply humiliating. Capone had spent years surrounded by loyal associates who followed his orders without question. Now he was just another prisoner standing in line for meals. At first, other inmates treated him with curiosity. Capone was already famous across the United States. Newspapers had written about him for years. Some prisoners hoped his reputation would protect them. Others resented the attention he received. But Capone quickly realized something important. His reputation meant very little inside Alcatraz. There was no criminal empire here, no gang members to command, no politicians to bribe, only guards, routines, and locked cells. While serving his sentence, Capone's health began to deteriorate. Years earlier, he had contracted a serious illness known as syphilis. Because he had never properly treated the disease, it slowly progressed over time. By the mid-1930s, the illness had begun affecting his nervous system. Doctors noticed changes in his behavior. He sometimes appeared confused. At other times, he struggled to concentrate or remember simple details. The once confident and intimidating gangster began to look weaker and more fragile. Prison staff also noticed the changes. Capone's physical strength declined. His once commanding presence faded. The man who had once controlled Chicago's criminal empire now spent long hours quietly inside his prison cell. For many observers, the transformation was shocking. The powerful gangster who had terrified rivals and dominated headlines was slowly becoming a shadow of his former self. While Capone remained imprisoned, his organization began to collapse. Without his leadership, the network he had built quickly weakened. Rival gangs moved in to claim territory. Speakeasies changed suppliers. Bootlegging operations shifted to new leaders. The enormous empire Capone had controlled during the 1920s gradually disappeared. Chicago's criminal underworld continued to exist, but new figures replaced the old leadership. Capone's era was ending, and by the time he eventually left prison, the world he had once ruled would be completely different. Rallis Ephraim Prison. After serving several years in prison, Capone's health continued to decline. Doctors determined that his condition required medical treatment outside the prison system. In 1939, Capone was released early, but the man who walked out of prison was no longer the powerful crime boss who had once dominated Chicago. Years of illness had taken a heavy toll. His mental and physical condition had deteriorated significantly. He could no longer manage complex business operations or criminal networks. Instead, Capone returned to live quietly with his family. He moved to a large house in Florida. There, far away from Chicago's violent streets, he spent most of his remaining years living in relative isolation. Yes, during the 1940s, Capone's health continued to decline. His illness affected both his mind and body. Family members cared for him as best they could, but the damage caused by years of untreated disease could not be reversed. The man who had once controlled millions of dollars and commanded hundreds of loyal followers now lived a quiet and limited life. Visitors sometimes found it difficult to believe he had once been one of the most powerful criminals in America. Gone was the confident voice and commanding presence. In their place was a frail man whose memory often drifted between the past and present. Al Capone. On January 25, 1947, Al Capone died at the age of 48. The official cause of death was cardiac arrest after a stroke and pneumonia. The news of his death spread quickly. Although many years had passed since his time as Chicago's most powerful gangster, his name was still famous. Newspapers across the country reported the story. For some people, his death marked the end of one of the most dramatic chapters in American criminal history. Even decades after his death, Al Capone remains one of the most recognizable figures in the history of organized crime. Movies, books, documentaries, and television shows continue to tell the story of his rise and fall. Part of the fascination comes from the contradictions in his life. He was ruthless and violent, yet sometimes presented himself as a generous public figure. He built an empire worth millions of dollars, yet it collapsed because of a simple tax investigation. He once ruled Chicago's underworld, yet ended his life quietly and far removed from the power he once held. Capone's story is a reminder of how quickly power can rise and fall, and how even the most powerful criminal empire can eventually collapse. Because in the end, no one is truly untouchable, not even the King of Chicago after Capone. By the time Al Capone left prison in 1939, the world he had once dominated no longer existed. The Chicago he returned to was very different from the city he had ruled during the roaring 1920s. Prohibition had ended in 1933. Alcohol was legal again. The massive profits that had fueled the violent bootlegging wars had disappeared almost overnight. Speakeasies closed. Illegal breweries shut down. The criminal economy that had once made men like Capone unbelievably wealthy was gone, but organized crime itself did not disappear. Instead, it adapted. Crime families shifted their attention to new businesses. Illegal gambling operations expanded. Loan sharking became more common. Labor unions were infiltrated and used for profit and influence. In cities across the United States, criminal organizations evolved into complex networks that controlled entire industries. And although Capone was no longer active, the system he helped build continued to shape organized crime for decades. Even while Capone lived quietly in Florida, his reputation continued to grow. Stories about his life spread through newspapers, magazines, and radio programs. Some stories described him as a ruthless gangster responsible for countless acts of violence. Others portrayed him almost like a celebrity outlaw. During the Great Depression, many Americans struggled to survive. Millions were unemployed. Banks collapsed. Families lost their homes. In this environment, Capone sometimes appeared strangely sympathetic to the public. He had once opened soup kitchens that served thousands of free meals to people in need. He donated money to charities, and he often spoke to reporters with humor and confidence. To some people, Capone seemed like a rebellious figure who had beaten a system they no longer trusted. Of course, the reality was far more complicated. Behind the public image was a criminal organization built on intimidation, violence, and illegal business operations. But myths have a powerful way of shaping history, and over time, the legend of Capone grew even larger than the man himself. Hollywood quickly recognized the power of Capone's story. Movies about gangsters became extremely popular during the 1930s and 1940s. Characters inspired by Capone appeared in countless films. These stories often dramatized the rise and fall of powerful criminals who built empires before ultimately facing justice. The gangster film became one of the most recognizable genres in American cinema. Capone's life provided the perfect blueprint for this type of storytelling. A poor immigrant boy rises from the streets. He builds an empire of power and wealth. He becomes feared across the country. And eventually, his success collapses under the weight of crime and corruption. This dramatic narrative captured the imagination of audiences. Even decades later, Capone continues to appear in movies, television shows, books, and documentaries. His name has become almost synonymous with organized crime. Legendi. Despite the myths and Hollywood portrayals, the real story of Al Capone is more complex than the legend. Capone was not the first organized crime boss in America, and he was not the last. But he became the most famous because his rise happened during a unique moment in American history. Prohibition created the perfect conditions for criminal empires to grow rapidly. Demand for alcohol remained enormous. Law enforcement struggled to control illegal production and distribution. And criminals who could organize large operations made huge profits. Capone understood how to exploit that opportunity better than almost anyone else. He built a network of breweries, transportation routes, and speakeasies that operated with remarkable efficiency. At its peak, his organization earned tens of millions of dollars every year. But that success also made him a target. Public attention, media coverage, and government pressure eventually focused directly on Capone. And once that attention arrived, his empire began to collapse. Lasso's Ofkins fell. The fall of Capone's empire demonstrated something important about organized crime. Violence and intimidation might build power quickly, but maintaining that power over time is much more difficult. Capone's organization depended heavily on illegal alcohol. When Prohibition ended, the entire foundation of that business disappeared. Without the massive profits from bootlegging, many criminal operations had to change direction. The government also learned important lessons. Law enforcement agencies realized that financial investigations could be extremely effective against organized crime. Instead of focusing only on violent crimes, investigators began examining money flows and tax records. This strategy would later be used against many other criminal organizations. In that sense, Capone's conviction changed the way authorities approached organized crime in the United States. Today, nearly a century after his rise to power, the name Al Capone remains instantly recognizable. Few figures in criminal history have left such a lasting cultural impact. Part of this legacy comes from the dramatic nature of his life. His story contains all the elements of a powerful narrative: ambition, power, violence, wealth, and ultimately downfall. Capone's life also represents a unique moment in American history. The Prohibition era created opportunities that allowed organized crime to grow on an unprecedented scale. For a brief period, criminals like Capone operated almost like business executives running enormous illegal corporations. But that era eventually ended, and with it, the empire Capone had built began to fade into history. During the height of his power, Al Capone was often called the King of Chicago. His organization controlled vast sections of the city's illegal economy. Hundreds of speakeasies relied on his alcohol supply. Police officers and politicians sometimes feared his influence, and rival gangs respected the power of his network. For several years, Capone appeared unstoppable, but like many powerful figures throughout history, his success contained the seeds of its own destruction. The more powerful he became, the more attention he attracted, and that attention eventually led to the investigation that brought him down. In many ways, Capone became a symbol of the entire Prohibition era. His story reflects the contradictions of that time. A law intended to reduce crime instead created enormous criminal enterprises. Cities experienced both economic growth and rising violence, and criminals sometimes became public celebrities. Capone stood at the center of all these contradictions. He represented both the glamour and the brutality of organized crime. T.G. Final Ref F.I.T.O.N. When people hear the name Al Capone, they often imagine a powerful gangster surrounded by loyal followers and enormous wealth. But the final chapter of his life tells a very different story. After years of illness and decline, Capone spent his last days far removed from the world he once controlled. The criminal empire he had built had vanished. The violent struggles for territory had moved on to new figures, and the once feared gangster lived quietly with his family. In the end, the man who had once dominated Chicago's underworld died not as a powerful crime boss, but as a fading figure from a past era. Yet the story of his rise and fall continues to fascinate people around the world, because it reminds us of something timeless. Power can grow quickly, wealth can accumulate rapidly, but no empire lasts forever, and eventually even the most powerful king must leave the throne.